All right, are we ready if we get started? Are we good? Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this event today with Professor John Inazu of Washington University Law School. My name is John Stinneford from the Hamilton Center and from the law school here at UF. Before we get started, I wanted to honor the late Senator Bob Graham, who passed away today. He was a legendary figure in Florida politics. Just briefly, and again, his career spanned almost 40 years, so you can't cover all of it, but he served as a state legislator, a governor, a United States senator in Florida, known for his achievements in environmental law, intelligence and national security, and in education. He also was known for his work days, where he would go and work a day in various entry-level jobs around the state, so he could get a sense of what it was like to be a working person in Florida. Senator Graham had a particular passion for civic education, which started in 1974 when he accepted an invitation to teach civics for a day at a Miami-Dade high school, and which culminated ultimately in the founding of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service here at UF, which is a co-sponsor of tonight's event, along with the Dial Center for Communication. The Graham Center and the Hamilton Center are both dedicated to preparing students for active citizenship, which includes learning to engage with those with whom we disagree. Which brings us to tonight's event. Tonight, we are honored to have Professor John Inazu to speak about his new book, Learning to Disagree. And let me just give you a brief background for Professor Inazu. John Inazu's scholarship focuses on the First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion, and related questions of legal and political theory. His books include Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, and Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. Professor Inazu is the special editor of a volume on law and theology published in Law and Contemporary Problems, and co-editor with Tim Keller of Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference. His articles have appeared in a number of law reviews and specialty journals, and he's written broadly for mainstream audiences in publications including The Atlantic, USA Today, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. Prior to law teaching, Professor Inazu clerked for Judge Roger Woolman of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit and served for 4 years as an Associate General Counsel with the Department of the Air Force at the Pentagon. So, Professor Inazu, welcome. We're here to talk about your book, Learning to Disagree. And so why don't we just start with a very broad question? What brought you to write this book? What is this book about, and what sort of brought you to it?
Yeah, thanks. And I should first say thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to all of the sponsors. And as we honor Senator Graham today, I'm also mindful I hold the Sally Danforth Chair at Washington University, named after former Senator John Danforth's wife, and I think it'll come up today, there was a spirit of our national politics of an earlier era that seems to be lacking in many ways today, so it's maybe proper to invoke some of the people who were there before us. This book for me started at the height of the pandemic, where at least in Missouri, or at least where I live in Missouri, people were very shut down and isolated, and then shouting at each other across the internet about various COVID policies, and the outrage matched with this emotional insecurity and detachment amplified everything. And I was starting to think we have to have a better way to come back and try to engage with one another. And it occurred to me that even though our reputation as lawyers is sometimes those people who argue all the time and are stubborn and not helpful, that the best lawyering and the kinds of students we teach are the lawyers who learn how to deeply understand the other side of an argument, if only to be able to win at that argument, but in the work of understanding, in the work of teaching and learning and practicing law, you're actually displaying a work of empathy to learn well the other side, and that there are ideas and principles from that kind of education that are also applicable to the Thanksgiving dinner table, the workplace discussion, and the kinds of things that a lot of people in this country right now are trying to figure out. So I wanted to try to make the play to make the case for why the stuff that we do has a role to play in not coming to agreement, because our differences are not going away, but living with our differences in a healthier manner.
That's very interesting. Can I ask just a follow-up on your point about sort of law school and empathy, right? Because again, lawyers are not known to be particularly empathetic. But just to give a little background for those of us who are fortunate enough not to be lawyers or law students, can you describe how that process works in class? That sort of that the ability to recognize and articulate differing arguments?
Yeah, I think it's, for me, one of the privileges of being able to teach lawyers is you get these really complex and hard issues, and you do a couple of things with them. One, you teach students, we spend our days reading majority opinions and dissenting opinions, where really smart people have different views of what the law is and should be, and maybe even what the facts are, and they have to write out justifications for their positions. That's a very lost practice in a lot of governance today, so there's a value in that. It also shows you, I think, that the hardest questions and hardest cases are hard for a reason. It's rarely the case that it's the right answer in those idiots. It's usually a very complex issue with different perspectives and different ways of seeing things, and part of teaching law is trying to get your head around both sides of the arguments. And sometimes that also involves being able to make a persuasive case to a third party, whether it's a judge or another decision maker, and you're not going to be persuasive if you present the straw man of the other side. What you have to do is say, here's a really good argument for this position, and now I'm going to tell you why my position is better. And that kind of skill and teaching that we help our students learn is key to this thing of legal education.
Okay, so I do this. Do you force students to say, to articulate arguments that they disagree with and sort of pretend that it's their argument?
I do, yeah. And I think that's, it's important as a skill, but there's also a dance to that, because you want, the trick, I think, is you want your students and you want your future lawyers to be very clinical at their professional work, to be able to be laser sharp, and not to be, I sometimes tell them, just like I don't want my surgeon to come in the operating room and freak out at blood, I don't want my lawyer to be, thrown off kilter by an offensive argument or something like that. At the same time, I want my surgeon and my lawyer to retain their humanity and see me as a human being and not just client number 17 or patient number 23. And so the art of teaching students how to be clinical and focused and not distracted by the kinds of things that maybe without that training might throw them really off kilter, and at the same time remember there are human beings involved in all these issues, and it's not just a game you're playing, but there are lives that are affected by this.
Yeah. So what do you do when you're asking a student to articulate an argument that they find morally offensive in some way? Do you have an example of that? You could imagine, for example, if it's a constitutional law class and you're teaching the Dobbs opinion, right? And you may say to a student, well, what's the majority's reasoning here? Articulate their argument. And they may not like that. Or alternatively, they may not like articulating the argument in Roe versus Wade if they feel strongly against abortion. So how do you manage that if you have a student who seems to be reluctant because they disagree or even are strongly offended by?
Yeah, some of it is just sort of being clear about what the expectations and rules of the game are. We are here to learn how to make compelling, persuasive arguments about facts and circumstances and laws that are presented to us. This isn't a pick and choose. The upper level you get to choose a bit, but in the first year we don't say what classes do you want to take and what do you want to learn about? We say, here's what you're going to learn and here are the cases you're going to grapple with. And there's actually something, let's be clear, it is a form of indoctrination, very intentionally, but there's something useful and important about that. And I think when you can level set and table set and say, this is the activity that we are going to work on together, and sometimes it'll be arguments you agree with and sometimes it'll be arguments that you find detestable, but as a lawyer, you should be able to do this. I sometimes give the example, my grandparents as Japanese Americans were interned during the Second World War. My dad was born in the camps. There was a decision from the Supreme Court, Korematsu, that upheld constitutionally that action. I think it is a reprehensible and constitutionally flawed decision. And if you ask me to make a case for why that decision works, I can make that case. I can make an argument about an opinion that was personally deeply harmful to my family, that is, I think, constitutionally flawed, and yet as a lawyer, I can and should be able to make an argument in the other direction.
Okay. So now, so far, when we're talking about this sort of empathy, I guess, right? The ability to understand your opponent, to walk in your opponent's shoes. In part, in law school, that's so that you can destroy your opponent, right? I mean, like you need to understand your opponent so you can defeat your opponent, right? You need to give the best version of their argument so that you can give a better version. But in your book, I noticed when you talk about empathy, you also talk about a different, what struck me at least is a different kind of empathy. Like when you talk about the Dudley and Stevens case. And so maybe could you talk to the audience a little bit about that case and about how that goes in class?
Yeah, and I like your point here that there are different, I think, teaching empathy or modeling empathy comes in different forms. So some of it is just trying to get your head into the other side of the argument. Some of it is realizing that you are limited in your own experiences and your own capacity to be able to fully understand the other side. So there's kind of a modesty and a humility that comes with proper empathy too. Dudley and Stevens is a case about cannibalism. I start my criminal law class with it. It's an old English case, 4 guys on a life raft, and they're starving and no one's coming. And so three of the guys team up and kill and then eat the other guy. And so the question is, it raises a fascinating set of questions about moral culpability and relative culpability. Does it matter who came up with the plot, who actually committed the killing, who did other actions in that scenario? And when I teach the class, the very first instinct is always, well, that's awful, that's reprehensible, that's not what people do, and let's punish it. Obviously, they deserve to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. But as we get into it more, what I try to help students see is, how do you even know what you would do in that situation? I mean, maybe, I skip one meal and I'm kind of grouchy. Maybe some of my students have been in circumstances where they can't eat for a day or two, but nobody's been shipwrecked on the high seas for weeks on end. And when you think about what is it actually like to be in that headspace in this small little boat where you're dying together and you're not thinking rationally, and then even in the act of what you do in that small confined space, what does that do to your humanity? And could any of us just say so self-assuredly, well, that is beneath me, I would never do that, and then try to extrapolate that to lots of other hard circumstances in life, where often our first instinct is to be judgmental and say, well, they really screwed up, or that's really a bad person. And yet, when we stop to think about it, are we that far off in some of the decisions we would make faced with similar circumstances and similar challenges? So there, the work of empathy is to say, it doesn't mean you never pass judgment, because that would be a form of relativism that society couldn't handle. So you do have to make decisions, you do have to pass moral and legal judgments, but it's at least a plea to slow down a bit and to be less self-assured about separating, those of us who are reasonable, law-obeying people and those other people who are really screwing up, because maybe we're closer than we think.
Right. Is that, and as you're talking, I was thinking of your initial reference to the COVID debate, right? I mean, that in a sense, the part of the lack of a genuine interaction in the COVID debates was an inability on either side to see what was driving the people on the other side, right? The legitimate interests that they had or that they felt.
Yeah, I think that's a great tie and link. And then it also relates to a later point that I make, which is that sometimes this lack of empathy is complicated by our own inability to name and recognize the non-neutrality of our own position. So we convince ourselves that we're so right and those people are so wrong that we must have the truth. COVID's a great example here. There was no COVID policy in America that was just following the science. Every single COVID policy that unfolded in this country was a hard mix of science and epidemiology and predictions and law and policy exemptions for special interests. And at the end of all of that, people came up with policies. Some of them were more reasonable than others, and they changed over time. And we had debates about those. But what the challenge is, and this is when I saw sort of tempers flare, when people started screaming at each other, we have the truth, or we have, your decision here is anti-science, and rather than starting with the position, this is a hard issue, we're doing the best we can, we think the least harmful move is this, we think the most risk-averse move is that, here are the costs and benefits. And the real problem here is is when you overclaim about your own position, and when you seem to be too certain and failing to recognize your own lack of neutrality, you're actually opening the door for and reinforcing that segment of our country that really is increasingly detached from just reality. The people in this country who would debate whether today is Wednesday, right? Or, I mean, so we actually, there really are facts of the world, and there are people in this country who are denying facts of the world. But when the rest of us start to overclaim and say, no, my COVID policy is just a fact of the world, then the reaction and the response is, well, they're doing it too. And so, you say tomato, I say tomato, you say this is your COVID policy, I say today's not Wednesday, and then we're in a really rough spot about how to even maintain discourse. So I think, especially because of this weird moment where we have increasingly people in echo chambers who are denying reality, it's even more incumbent on the rest of us to be very careful and qualified with the claims we're making.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, again, this goes a little bit beyond the scope of your book, although maybe it ties back to some of your earlier work as well. When the government communicates to us, right, is there a sense in which the government needs to be more aware of the varying sort of positions and emotions and concerns of the people in terms of what they communicate about a crisis, for example, COVID, that sort of thing? Yeah,
or a crisis, or just politics generally. This is where I think, and this is very bleak because all of the incentives are aligned in the wrong way right now, but that politics, it seems to me, works best, or maybe only works, when it is about measured compromise and coalition building and reaching second best solutions to your policy preferences. And that has to start with the rhetoric of our leaders and the modeling and posturing that they're doing. And when that's replaced with, this is the purity test and you're evil, which is kind of happening in Washington right now, then we're in a very hard spot, and none of this is sort of without effect. So this is being modeled for, like if you're a high schooler now and your civics class is trying to figure out national politics, that's what you see, and like it's no wonder people are saying, I don't want any part of that. So it absolutely redounds to the rest of us too.
Okay. So again, the book is organized. It's a really interesting book, and just for those of you who haven't read it, which is probably everyone yet, but there's books over there you can buy, and you should, because it's a great read. The way the book is organized is chronologically through the scope, the course of an academic year, right? So starting in August, ending in May, and with stories about actual experiences that you had during the course of several years, but telescoped into 1 year, and then also organized by themes or a series of questions, right? So we've been talking about empathy, which was the question that you opened with. Can we be empathetic, or can we learn empathy? And I guess maybe I'll just move to the next topic, which is, I think, it strikes me as also very relevant to these policy questions we've been talking about, which is, can we know what's fair? Mm-hmm. So when we look to policy solutions to various problems, right? One thing we want is fairness. We want the government or whoever's in charge to do something that's fair. So what's your take on that question? How do we figure out what's fair in a given situation?
Yeah, this is, I think, another area where the law is really helpful as an illustration that in our imperfect and complicated human society, fairness is really elusive, kind of like justice. We all kind of intuit we want things to be fair and just, but that's very hard or maybe impossible to effectuate. And one of the ways that law helps show this is, in criminal law, for example, what is the fair punishment for an offense? Well, that has to depend on a whole lot of factors, including what happened, why it happened, what the background context was. And even if you could figure out fairness in that context, then you've got to deal with, well, what about the next case? And is there fairness not just within a single case, but across cases? What does parity look like across different cases? And you quickly realize we're left with proximate judgments. And we're left with human decision-making that involves wisdom and judgment and prudence, and sometimes gets it wrong. And so a demand for fairness or a demand for justice is, I think, doomed to fail in a a broken and imperfect system. It doesn't mean you give up on the effort, right? We don't just say like, oh, well, who cares? We can't get it. So you pursue a more just and a more fair society in different systems, but to recognize from the start that you're never going to get there and that this is going to be an impossible quest, I think is helpful in seeing why some of these things come out in harder and more difficult ways. And ultimately, it's sort of an example of human tragedy, right? This perfectly just world that we all long for is not going to happen, and we're stuck with figuring out what to do with that reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I got the sense from your chapter on this topic. I mean, the one of the underlying problems may be if you lack clarity as to what your substantive values are, then it's hard to know whether you're being fair in resolving a given dispute or problem because you haven't agreed upon a shared set of values, right? And that's, of course, one of the great critiques of liberalism, right, as a political system,
right.
Is that we put off the question of substantive values in exchange for procedural fairness. And you seem to be calling into question whether that's really possible. So are we just to be depressed about this, or is there some way to sort of approximate shared values so that we can reach agreement on procedural fairness and that sort of thing?
Well, I think we have to, I mean, we were talking with some students earlier today about the elusive notion of the common good. And you hear in public discourse, people talk about the need for the common good. And I said earlier today, I'm deeply skeptical about claims for the common good in a society as diverse and pluralistic as ours, because you can't name a common good with any coherence unless you can name your purpose or your end. And right now in this country, we have massive disagreements about the purpose of the country or the purpose of a human being or the nature of human flourishing. So without that, you can't, what do we agree on and where do we start? And so these substantive questions about, what is fair in pursuit of the common good, or what is just, what's a just tax policy or a just immigration policy? Those are, I think, unanswerable, and they depend on a lot of normative priors, some hidden and some exposed, but we're not going to reach agreement on those. So as a second best solution, to recognize the significance of some procedural agreements. We're going to debate and contest this notion of fairness, but we're going to protect the ability of people of all persuasions to dissent and to disagree and have civil liberties protections regardless of what they're saying relative to a majority position, so that we, as imperfect as it is, the experiment of democracy continues as a conversation. And if you lose at the polls or lose in your policy preferences, you still have the ability and some protections to argue against the people in power. Maybe at a place like a university or the University of Florida, part of that proceduralism is we're going to talk about lots of ideas and bring in different perspectives, but we're all here sharing a common mode of discourse, right? We're going to agree. We're not going to bring in a bunch of bomb throwers who are performative and trying to win sound bites, but we're going to bring in people who are educated about differing issues to debate and dialogue about them. And maybe we don't fill rooms as large with that, but they at least are participating in the procedures that we agree upon are important for the purpose of this institution.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because it's always struck me that, of course, people are willing to accept losing at the polls so long as they feel that the system overall approximates something good, right? That overall we're all struggling towards something good, even though we may have different conceptions of it. And of course, once people no longer see as legitimate the other side of a given issue, that's when there's a real risk of things falling apart, which I think some people think may be happening now. I wonder if, when you talk about empathy, whether there's some role for that in terms of reaching agreement about substantive values. Like, for example, when you mentioned immigration, I was thinking, most of the time, most of the people involved in debates over immigration don't know what it's like to be an immigrant, on the one hand. They also don't know what it's like to be a resident in a border town that's overwhelmed with immigrants. And so there's this sense in which the human stakes become very abstract, right? Mm-hmm. And so just as in punishment, I think a lot about punishment because that's what I write about. it used to be that punishments were public, and people would come to the town square and they would see the punishment. And during that time period, there was actually real political force behind moves for a reform of the criminal justice system. But once punishment moves behind prison walls and you can't really see what's happening, then all the political juice goes out of it because no one sees the suffering, right? So is there some way in a society as large as ours, with issues as complex as ours, and you may not have thought about this at all, but is there some way to kind of get the message across so that people feel empathy on both sides of a given issue so that they can make a more reasoned judgment about the best policy outcomes?
Well, I think, as a just descriptive strategic point, yes, and we have evidence of this too, right? I think much of the cultural success of the gay rights movement was not just having abstract policy discussions, but it was presenting sympathetic experiences. Will and grace was, things like this, or showing people you have a gay neighbor, so that this wasn't left to the level of abstraction. And your immigration example too, when you get actual human beings talking about this is my experience. There are very few substitutes for actual people with experience talking about these issues to drive home how complicated and how complex they are. And it's actually quite hard to, it's much harder to be unmoved and doctrinaire when you're dealing with a human being rather than an abstraction or a social media persona. That's why it's so easy to take it all out on social media, because it's just a one-dimensional person who you don't actually know. But find a person who's different than you on any issue, get to know them, and then it's a lot harder to say, oh yeah, that's just that evil person, right? It suddenly becomes, oh, this is my friend Ibu, who is a Muslim, but he's not the Muslims. He is my Muslim friend Ibu, and we have some significant differences, but we're also friends. And when I hear certain people talking about the Muslims, I don't think of an abstract category. I think of Ibu and Asma and other friends of mine with whom I do life, and that humanizes, right, a category of people in a way that would not be possible if you were just listening to partisan coverage.
Right. It's sort of like when I'm grading my law school exams and it's anonymous grading. I find myself getting very, very angry at the students sometimes, and then of course I see them, and when they come for the exam review, I'm like, oh, you're a great person, I love you. It's a different feeling seeing someone face to face versus interacting over a screen or over a document or whatever it may be.
Going back to the COVID example, I think one of the, at least in our kind of small slice of the world, I was very struck when in-person academic conferences shut down and went away, and we were just left with Zoom, because they tried to do these Zoom conferences. They were terrible, right? But you'd still have your same panels and discussions, and they would end, and then you click off, right? And you'd be done. Whereas the whole point of these conferences was the panel would end, and you'd kind of wander up and chit chat, and then you'd go get a drink, and then you go out to dinner. And these people, you didn't otherwise see them. You didn't always agree. Maybe you didn't even like them that much, but you were forced to have human interactions with them. And when all of that went away and it was just Zoom, then we were just back to the one-dimensional interactions that I think increased the fracture and animosity in some ways.
Right. So social media, how do we solve social media?
That's your next lecture, I guess. I'm not going to give you that answer.
Well, so then I'll move on to the next topic then. So, because, and again, they flow very nicely. When you read the book, as you all should do, you don't get a sense that it's flowing thematically, but I think that when you think about it and go through it a second time, you sort of see how they flow. And so the next topic actually is sort of what happens when we can't compromise. So there are some issues that can't be resolved through compromise. There's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser. There may be an answer that really is right and another one that really is wrong. How do we manage situations when we can't compromise and we don't win? Mm-hmm. Like what do we do there?
Yeah, I think the punchline here is, in a diverse democracy, in a systems of politics, there are many situations where there will be winners and losers, and we are inevitably going to be winners and losers. So think about how we occupy those roles, and how do you win and lose in a way where your neighbor might be feeling quite differently, and also the roles are going to be reversed next year or next election cycle or whatever it is. And so the recognition that this is going to happen, and the recognition that you will occupy both roles. So one of the examples I mentioned in the book, which is maybe low stakes, although it's personal to me, is I happen to be someone who has significant allergies. And I don't say this in the book, but when I was tested 10 years ago for environmental allergies, and they tested me for 61 trees, dogs, cats, and I was allergic to 57 of them. I actually had an allergic reaction to the allergy test, and my allergist said, the medically appropriate solution here is to put you in a bubble, but we're not gonna be able to do that. So instead, I take lots of shots and 3 medicines a day. But the point here is I also, because of these allergies, when I get on an airplane and I find myself sitting next to a dog, right? This is a situation of no compromise. And it turns out the dog lover has won, because for whatever reason, the airlines have said, if you pay a certain price, you get to bring your dog on board the plane with you. Maybe some of you have done this. Maybe some of you have never thought about me, right? Sitting next to you in that seat, and my eyes start watering and my nose starts running, and the flight is far less comfortable for me because of the presence of that dog. That is a zero-sum, not possible of compromise solution. Either the dog is there or the dog is not. And I've lost that policy debate, at least for now. And the point is, well, what do you do as a loser, right? I mean, there's a quantifiable amount of suffering in that situation. It's not extreme suffering. There are far weightier examples. But the point is, we're a diverse society with very different preferences, some of them about dogs and allergies, some of them deeply moral. There are winners and losers. If you are on the losing side, keep working, especially if you really care about the issue, keep working to change things, but don't give up in despair. And if you're on the winning side, don't rest your laurels on having won, because your win is likely temporary, and you still have to live alongside, work, play, and learn with the people who think very differently than you. And maybe there's a practical point here. I was just thinking of this as we're talking, but the same thing with lots of past, present, and future national events, right? You, in a community like this, you will be alongside people who experience events almost the opposite of you, right? After an election, for example, there will be some people despairing and some people rejoicing. But for the sake of your community, just be aware of that difference, right? This is not like after 9/11 when everyone is appalled at the same time. And we have lots of examples of this, I think, in society, where we just have to be aware of the fact of some zero-sum elements of our politics plus very different preferences and reactions means we're going to experience the same thing quite differently. And if we care about the people around us as a community, an awareness of that is at least a good first step.
Yeah. Now, you make the point in the book that when it comes to the law, of course, when we can't reach compromise, the law uses force, right? At some point, the sheriff will show up at your house and take all your stuff, or they'll send you to prison. I was briefly a federal prosecutor, and I remember learning viscerally for the first time when I was at a sentencing for one of my defendants and saw his wife and children crying and realized that he was going to go to prison for 10 years. He was never going to see them again. He was on the receiving end of that force, right? The government force, which is very real. And so and your book doesn't speak to this directly, but maybe your thoughts, what are your thoughts on when should the government use force? Is it using force too much? How should government officials be thinking about force, given that the objects of the force are human persons who suffer as a result of it?
Yeah, so this is a super important point related to what happens when we can't compromise. So I'm glad you flagged it. When we live in a political society with deep differences that surfaces issues that are incapable of compromise, we have thus far chosen to resolve those issues often through law of some sort. Sometimes it's the legislature, sometimes it's the courts, sometimes it's law enforcement keeping that going. But that ability to resolve incommensurable issues through this discourse of law is an alternative to unchecked violence. And so there are people I know right now with very different views of this country, and you can be very despondent about this country and still say, and I'm grateful at the end of the day that we are law governed. You might not like what the Supreme Court's doing. You might think that the executive branch is overplaying its hand, but we are not in a lawless society. And we have today examples of other places in the world that are lawless, and lots of people are dying, especially the most vulnerable people. So I actually think it's a tremendous privilege to be able to be talking about law as the means through which we resolve an inability to compromise as an alternative to outright unchecked violence. And then at the same time, law also only works because it is ultimately predicated on the threat or use of violence. So this is what I message to my students, and they especially the ones who are not going to be federal prosecutors, the ones who are going to be Wall Street lawyers, they hate this class because they don't want to be told that but it is a fact of the world that the reason your client is going to listen to you, maybe you're doing the business transaction for the Fortune 100 company, your client's going to listen to you because you know the law, and the law is going to help them on the grounds of being able to enforce that claim through an interpretation of a contract or whatever it is, where the person who refuses to accept that adjudication, especially by a judge, will ultimately be met with force. And it might be the U.S. Marshals showing up saying, you better change your ways, but if you don't, you're going to get handcuffs, you're going to be led away to your former colleagues, and you're going to find yourself in prison or worse. And that's why the law works. And most of us are kind of blissfully unaware of that because most of us follow the law in our daily lives. But if you wake up tomorrow and say, I'm just going to test this out, I'm not going to pay the mortgage and see what happens. I mean, give it a few days and you will find that the law is backed by coercion and ultimately violence. And so I think I want to say two things about that. One, I'm very grateful for a system that restrains unchecked violence. And at the same time, we should be aware of what's happening in that system and how it all works. And it should make us, especially those of you who are training to be lawyers, take it seriously. This is a profession for a reason. And it's not just interpreting your favorite poem, it's interpreting a text that is harnessing the coercive force of the state to get done what you're trying to get done.
Absolutely. And I will say, that I'll challenge you on one thing. You said we're all law-abiding. I always make the point to my students, we are all federal criminals, every one of us, because there are hundreds of thousands of federal regulations that cross-list with criminal statutes. Every one of us has committed a federal crime. It's just that most of us don't get prosecuted for it. And I would make the point then, if you ever are a prosecutor, you need to actually remember empathy, right? Because you need to make sure you're making good choices about how to use force. Because a prosecutor can bring to bear the force of the federal government on almost anyone they want to. And it's very, very important that the proper choices are made. So anyway, that's my soapbox
Well, right,
moment.
and this is a little off topic, but super important since you brought it up. And I think for so much of this now happens outside of the public eye.
Yeah.
So pay attention. You and I might just see a news story or an outcome, but what's happening behind closed doors with plea agreements and pressuring, and the very point that a federal prosecutor can walk in and say, guess what? You can go to jail or you can cooperate. And most of us might not experience this in our daily lives, but there's a ton of power there. So I think we both want people who are thinking about that and aware of the stakes rather than just playing a game.
Yeah. I think the best description I ever heard was from a seasoned prosecutor who said, every case is a tragedy, and you should think of every case as a tragedy. But moving back a little bit from policy now. So we've been talking in general terms about feeling empathy, about dealing with situations where you can't compromise. But you do have a very interesting chapter on having difficult conversations. Which strikes me as a real skill. And it's a skill that all of us, including I, are probably lacking in to some degree. So what are your thoughts on building that skill of having a difficult conversation with someone? And when might it be appropriate, when might it not be appropriate to have a conversation like that?
Yeah, so I end this chapter by saying I actually do think it's possible to have difficult conversations, but the context really matters here. So, and this is, some of you listening right now, the challenge to you is probably try having fewer of these, right? You have a little too many of these difficult conversations, and it turns out probably the world doesn't need to hear from you on all of the issues that you like to surface. But there are other people who actually need the opposite nudge, right? It's a little more courage to try. And I think the common factor here is, in both cases, can you discern the right relationships of trust? Because you're not going to be able to do it all. So what are the right relationships of trust in which you can work toward a really difficult conversation? And you don't want to be premature about it. So you want to make sure that you've laid those conditions and those foundations. And that might mean that you delay a conversation, or it might mean you work really hard about the predicate, just relationship building. And then when I'm thinking through this in the book and talking to people about this, I usually say, don't start with family, because family conversations, the difficult family conversations, are the hardest. And when we think about it, there's just a lot going on with family. They know us the best. It's complex. We've shared a lot of history, and sometimes the history has not really kept up with the present. And they're just hard and fraught for a lot of reasons. And then I mentioned, one holiday back home in Colorado, I failed to heed my own advice, and my dad and I got in one of these conversations that did not have the predicate trust reservoir, and it got very hard and charged, and we stopped talking for a year. And that was, my kids were growing up, and this was a very hard moment of life. And then I got a phone call that he had a stage 4 cancer diagnosis. And that was it's not always this dramatic, but that was a clear moment for me, like, oh, we need to start talking again, because there's not a lot of time not to talk. And so I made a bunch of intentional visits, and we were able to be more candid, more honest, more caring and empathetic with each other, largely because we both knew that there wasn't much time to do it. And so I think sometimes the circumstances will force you and allow you and motivate you to have those hard conversations. And other times you need to discern and figure out when to delay them. But they are possible, and they're not always easy, but they're sometimes really important.
When you're in a conversation like that, is there any sort of stance that you should take, or any stance towards the person you're talking to that may bring you successfully through?
Well, I think go in with a full tank of gas. So don't do one of these like exhausted or lonely or discouraged. Like, make sure you're ready for this, right? And if you can have kind of a posture of openness to ask questions, to demonstrate curiosity, and to be willing to take some hits. Because often, right, what gets really hard about these, especially with people we know and care about, is it becomes emotional very fast, and it threatens a lot of things very fast. And if you can kind of step back and say, I need to keep asking questions, and even though that last comment really annoyed me or hurt me, there's something more at stake in this particular relationship or this conversation, so I'm just going to keep. I think if more of us had a little more thicker skin in some of these situations, where if we could kind of self-regulate and not amp it back up, but instead of respond. This is actually back to another lawyer skill, right? In the heated moment when your client or your adversary is losing it, and it's charged and your body is tensing up, you still want to be able to just respond in a measured way and to model a different way of engagement. I think we can do that in our more ordinary conversations too.
Great. Well, so we've reached the 45-minute mark. I could go on all night. A few topics we've not yet touched on, but you guys can, which I think are awesome. Can anything be neutral? How do we know the line between wrong and evil? Is forgiveness possible? Can we be friends? These are all topics that are very well treated in the book, but I don't have time to talk about now. You guys can ask about it. I will close with one final thing, because you had one of my favorite quotes from C.S. Lewis. How can we see people instead of problems? And the quote from C.S. Lewis says, there are no ordinary people. So what are your thoughts on that? And seeing the person rather than the problem when you're engaged in one of these difficult conversations.
Yeah. So I threw this chapter in kind of as almost like a self-diagnosis as much as anything, but just as a reminder that in this effort and work at disagreement, we also just have to remember the humanity of the people across from us in all of these situations. And I, as a type A efficiency-driven lawyer, am often just trying to maximize my day, and I forget about the people I encounter. And that's a very bad lawyer habit. And so a lot of this chapter is just confessing stories of failure along these lines. But one of the examples that comes to mind is that I mostly worked for the federal government, which does not involve the billable hour, but I had a stint in which I was billing my time. And it was a precarious family situation. We just had our second kid. We had this mortgage. We had lots of expenses. And this was my only employment, and it was paid hourly. So the billable hour was really important to me. And the more time I billed, the more money we made. And I was working one Saturday morning, and my wife and I got in, those arguments that you just know are going to take a long time to resolve when they kick off. And so this was and we spent all morning kind of arguing and trying to work through it. It took about 4 hours, and we finally apologized and made up. And then I looked at her and I said, "Do you know how much money this argument just cost us?" Which to me is a powerful illustration of seeing the problem and not a person, with pretty immediate consequences in my case. But it was, as my wife often helps me remember, not everything is reducible to dollars or efficiency, and real human beings in your world, including those close to you, but also people you don't know, who you just encounter in the middle of the day, they're so much more full and complex than whatever sliver of an encounter you're having with them. And when you forget that and you just instrumentalize them or see them as a problem to get through, you're doing a disservice to society, but also to yourself and to them. And so the reminder to see the fullness of people and not just interruptions and problems to your day.
Great. All right, well, let's open it up to questions. James, are you keeping the queue, or how are we doing this?
Why don't you point out who you want? We got a mic on that side, a mic on this side, and we'll just...
Do you want to?
You can do it.
I'll do. Oh, I'm terrible at this, but okay. I thought I saw. Oh, right there.
Thanks.
I call him a mic runner for a reason.
Hi, thank you first for giving this lovely discussion. And I just had a quick question, I guess, in the realm of, is forgiveness possible? So do you think that if we did not have a culture that viewed fairness as a form of retribution, that forgiveness would be easier to implement into social and cultural norms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what forgiveness opens up and in some ways depends upon is a hope and a aspiration that the injustice we experience and encounter with this world is not the end of the story, and that there's a way. And this is why I actually struggle with this concept, because there's part of me that thinks as a matter of sort of broad discourse, forgiveness itself has to depend on some kind of transcendent frame. Now, there's certainly examples where that's not the case. Nelson Mandela, for example, did not claim a particular religious faith, but was a powerful example of forgiveness, and yet that unfolded within a very distinctive narrative in South Africa. So but I think the power of forgiveness is the recognition that there is no justice, at least in this world, that fully remedies injustice. And what we long for as human beings, whether it's for ourselves or someone else we see, when we see an injustice in the world, we want that fully righted, and it's impossible. Right? No injustice that you encounter or know of will be righted by the law's retribution or remedy or anything else. The best the law can do is a kind of proximate justice. Right? John steals my iPhone.
Hey, you said you wouldn't mention that.
I know, but it's coming up. And we discover it and prosecute him. I get my phone back. Maybe he gets punished. But just because my phone is back doesn't mean that situation has been righted. There's a massive breach in our relationship and the broader social trust that lingers out there. And that's a pretty benign example. But think about someone who is murdered or assaulted in some way. Like, how do you? There's no justice that is bringing back that injustice or that rift in the world. And then forgiveness enters in as this, I would say, otherworldly possibility that is not always And not everyone's able to do this, and it can be very complicated, especially in very traumatic situations. But when it happens, it says, I am choosing not to let the fact of this injustice control our future forward. And rather than say, I need justice, which isn't possible, I'm choosing a different route. I'm changing the rules of the game. And so then to tie this back to your question, if we as a society were less focused on retribution, right? You did this crime, so you're going to jail for 5 years or whatever it is, as if that's going to sort of right the equation. If we were to start with the recognition that this is an imperfect world where injustices happen and will not be remedied, but there are possibilities. You can't force forgiveness or require forgiveness, but when it happens, if you can encourage it, that is actually I would say a more imaginative and a more hopeful version of a way forward. Tutu's book was titled No Future Without Forgiveness. And I think he meant that as a political claim, right? There is no future without forgiveness because massive injustice will not be remedied with some form of human justice.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that? I shouldn't do that, but I will.
No, that's great.
You reminded me of a situation I remember where a person killed another person. As a white person killed a black person. It was an off-duty police officer who did the killing and was guilty of or convicted of manslaughter. And she felt terrible. It was a mistaken identity kind of thing. And at sentencing, the brother of the victim forgave her and hugged her. And people, which I thought was beautiful, but a lot of people, like on Twitter, condemned the brother for forgiving her, right? And there is a notion abroad in society that it's morally wrongful to forgive, at least under some circumstances. So what do you make of that, and what do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, so this happens actually more frequently whenever there's sort of a nationally covered example of forgiveness. There's almost always now a national commentary that says you shouldn't forgive or you can't forgive. I mean, at a basic level, that's just whoever's making that claim is denying the agency of the person who has made the act of forgiveness, which, I mean, so then I would want to sort of question on what basis do you claim the right to deny the agency of the person who is enacting forgiveness? But it is there, and I think it's sort of building culturally that there are some people who would say, no, that's a costless way to address this. But it raises the question then of what do you, especially if you're going to insist on the impossibility of forgiveness, what is the alternative? What exactly rights this wrong, right? I mean, you're a lost loved one. How much punishment is enough? Will you actually feel like, tell me when you're going to feel like justice has been done in a full sense. I mean, I think a lot of people want that, but don't actually experience it, even in the criminal system where they see someone being punished for a wrong. And this reminds me too, one of the stories that I talk about in the book is the story of the Japanese American internment and my own family's experience with that. And some of you probably know in the early 80s, President Reagan signed legislation where each surviving person from the internment was given a $20,000 payment. Well, what's $20,000 for like a lost life? I mean, 4 years in prison, you lose all your assets, you lose your job, you lose your dignity. I don't know, like that wasn't justice by any stretch, but I think as I sort of talked through my own grandmother's experience where she chose forgiveness in that situation and to say, you know what, at the end of the day, I still love this country. Even though like, this country committed this horrific wrong that forever affected my family, and I'm choosing forgiveness to move forward, that it's possible. So to someone out there, like some pundit who might say she shouldn't forgive, I guess I would start with, who are you to talk about or question her agency in that situation? I actually think that because of her ability to forgive, I'm here today. My family has a very different story that would not have been possible without that, I think.
I think I saw your hand next.
Great conversation, thank you. I'm kind of shaking thinking about this because my stepfamily's Japanese, and there's a complicated history with that. I'd known my stepmother's father, or had known, for 45 years, and he went to Amachi, and He was 15 when he went there, and he had a rough couple of years, and then he went to go to school, and then he joined the army, and then he ended up in Port Missouri and interrogating the first Japanese army. And when he came back, he became the successful guy, and then I joined his family and those Thanksgiving discussions. And so I don't want to make this real long story, but it moved me. I was going along in your book, fine, okay, and it was a very good book, but then I got to this. And it's like, this is a direct experience that I've had. And so I was sitting there. I just had finished demonstrating at UC Davis. We got the regents to divest from South Africa. Reagan had just been elected, and we were so disappointed, most of us. And we were at the dinner table, and this man who had fought for our country, who had, had this injustice done to him, I connected Japanese fascism and Bushido with Reagan and his fascism. And there was a big argument, and it took about 15 years for me to apologize. And my stepmother had an idea that I could write his story a bit, and because I'm doing all this research and everything. So we started that fine, but as we went along and he was telling me about his Amachi experience, he didn't trust me. You said something about that, where there's a lack of requisite trust. And even though he forgave me, very easygoing guy, that never was resolved. He died last year. And I've always felt I did as much as I could, and I got a lot of the stuff down. And I just found out what a terrific guy he was. But I always go back to that Thanksgiving in Santa Ana, California, where I said that stupid stuff as a 22-year-old. And so I just appreciate the discussion. Anything you can add about that, I'd appreciate. Thank you.
Well, I mean, thanks for that sharing that story. And I think, it's a powerfully personal example from you where, like, what it actually makes me think of is the debates we're having around sort of speech limits right now. And as a First Amendment scholar, I think it's really important to protect speech. But your illustration, we should not kid ourselves about the power of words, right? Words, one conversation can destroy trust. The words we say to other human beings can upend lives. And I think what I worry about the current debate around speech are the people who say, I think the people who are often rightly arguing for broad protections of speech fail to acknowledge the cost sometimes. And I mean, and especially, look, you all are here at a public university. You've got a lot of protections and rights to say a lot of things, but with that comes a whole lot of responsibility. And, I mean, if you're showing up to this kind of talk, you're probably not a bomb thrower who's just trying to agitate by saying the most outlandish things, but probably there are still things where all of us in this room could work to be kinder in our words and more understanding. And when someone says, you know what, I didn't appreciate the way that you phrased that or the label that you used, rather than to say, double down and say, well, I've got a right to say what I want, maybe for the sake of aspiring toward a community, we would think, well, how could I say that differently? Or how can I because I think we don't want to have those, we want to minimize the number of those examples in our lives. And many of us will have them in spite of that. Yeah.
I'm going to look to this side of the room. Yes.
Hi there. Thank you very much for a terrific talk. So I'm a member of the LGBT community, and there are a lot of people out there who might deny my identity or even my personhood, which you said was very, very important to bridge the divides and come towards an understanding. First of all, my first question is, am I responsible for bringing that person to the table, and how might I do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I sometimes want to ask in that kind of a claim, when people say, and this is not to you in particular, but when people say you are denying my humanity, I want to know a little bit more about what the actual denial is, because I think that phrase gets used a lot. And so for if we're going to say, someone disagrees about, let's take an example I use in the book, Masterpiece Cake Shop, right? The guy doesn't want to bake the cake for the gay wedding. That is I think it's actually a pretty hard case. It might be a position where you might disagree with it, but I don't think, for example, that person would be denying your humanity. There are people out there who, for lots of reasons, including this particular identity characteristic, are actually going to say, I am denying your humanity, right? You shouldn't be able to, or your citizenship, you shouldn't be able to vote. I see you as not fully. And those kinds of situations, I actually don't, I mean, what do you do about it? Should you engage? I would say probably not, right? That life's too short to try to, and I don't really want to talk to a neo-Nazi or a person who says, like, you don't have a right to exist. Like, if they're actually saying that, and again, there are people saying those things, then choose a different conversation. Don't ignore them, because it's a dangerous part of our society. But short of that, are there people in your life or mine who might have different policy perspectives on a whole lot of issues that deeply affect you and me for various reasons? And if we're on the losing end of them, might it even, abortion, immigration, we can name a lot of policies where, back to our zero-sum discussion, if a certain perspective is enforced, people we know or care about, and maybe us, will have fewer freedoms than we would like. Those are costly and hard discussions. I don't think they reach the level of, you are denying my humanity. I think they might reach the level of, you are not understanding the harm of your position to me personally or people I care about. And that might very well be a conversation worth having, if only to try to persuade them and lots of other people that the better policy position is different. But I think the reason to belabor the point a little bit is, in those conversations, if you or I start with the perspective of, you are denying my humanity, we're kind of shutting down the conversation, and we're losing the possibility of persuasion down the road. So I think it's both an important point to make, because descriptively there are people in society who are, for various reasons, saying people of this characteristic are not fully human, should not deserve citizenship, and that's a dangerous segment of society to pay attention to, and work hard to persuade other people about more complex issues, if that makes sense. Thanks.
I'll do one more over here, and then I'll start swinging back this way. Yes.
It'd be more fun if you made them run back and forth.
Hi. So in your discussion, you talked about the importance of seeing a person as a person and not as a problem. So in your view, how do you balance or recognize or reconcile with ideological divides when someone sees you as a problem upon first discussion?
Yeah, so it kind of relates to the question we were just asking. Like, if you're with a person and you're discussing an issue, and their basic starting premise is not reciprocating, right? They're saying, I don't care if you see me as a person, I just see you as a problem, right? If there's no reciprocity, then maybe that person's just acting in bad faith, or maybe that person is so closed off that I'm back to my earlier point that life's too short to try to debate with everyone. So maybe your best move is not to have that discussion. Or if you feel like you're supposed to be in this relationship, if you're supposed to keep talking to them, then I think that a good starting point is to figure out ways to remind that person of why you are a complex human being yourself, and that there's more to you than whatever the issue is that's getting in the way or dominating your discourse. Start talking about other things, right? And remind, there's just something very human to this. It's very hard to relate to another human being and all of their full humanity and stay fixated on this one issue that you go in wanting to be purely defining your relationship or the most divisive between you. So do ordinary things with that person. And if after a long time they still only see you as a problem, then that might be time to move on. But I would say don't start by giving up, right? Actually, I think that the hard work of being in relationships with someone is often successful at complicating the "you're just a problem" perspective.
Okay, so more towards the center now. Yes.
Hi, thanks. So, at various points you talked about the predicate of trust, and I certainly agree that's going to be crucial for useful conversations. And you talked about the fact that nowadays many people see people who disagree with them as evil, right? One of the things that I think is very vexing, though, is, a lot of your advice requires being empathetic, humanizing the person, all of which I think is great. But sometimes you have good reason to think that people are acting in bad faith. If I'm talking to somebody, I'm trying to be empathetic, trying to humanize them, but I also realize, at least I think I realize, right, that they're acting in bad faith. I don't know what on earth I can do, right? I'm not going to try to say, here are some people I know who are acting in bad faith. That would just raise hackles. But I think this does happen a lot these days. And I can't relate in a genuine way to people who I think are actually, they don't give a damn about substantive values. They're more nihilistic than anything else. I think he recognized the existence of such people a little while ago. I hate to say it, but I think there's a lot of them. And I don't know how I would interact with them. And sometimes we can't just step away because they have some power, right? Let me just tell you what I think might be sensible and just see what you think about this. So if I were stuck having a conversation with somebody who I thought was really not acting in good faith, and I want to be honest with them too, well, I wouldn't tell them I think they're acting in good faith, but I would just go along with the pretense, not because I think they really are acting in good faith, but because I think if you get everybody acting as if everybody's acting in good faith, it's a kind of fake it till you make it situation. And so people end up acting that way anyway, so you might sort of make it not relevant. Anyway, that's my strategy if I ever have to deal with person unnamed or person unnamed. But I just wonder what you think about that problem that, we have good reason to think there are people acting in bad faith. And that suggested strategy. Thank you.
So super complex and interesting question there. I think it depends a lot on, you mentioned or you threw in the possibility of a relationship with someone who is in a position of power. And in those situations, so step one, I don't think you have to fight every battle. So if you're surrounded by people who are acting in bad faith, just work to find new friends or, limit the amount of people who are acting in bad faith in your life. If it's someone in power and you really think that bad faith position is harmful, then do what you can to get the person out of power. I would say in a law-abiding way, right? That build coalitions to have people of good faith in those positions of influence and power. But I actually think the people acting in bad faith or the people who are denying the humanity of other human beings, they're not going to show up to a talk like this, and they're not going to be interested in learning how to disagree or the future. They're just trying to win or trying to crush what they see as the other side. And so in some ways, the fact of the world is they are out there, they're a political reality, and I sure hope that the influence of those perspectives is minimized. I'm much more interested in making an argument to the rest of us. And my worry about the rest of us is that we are increasingly following into their bad habits. So that we are now saying it's not just a few outliers who are acting in bad faith or who are evil, but everybody to the political left of me is now evil, or everyone to the political right of me is evil. And that's not a functional recipe for our society. And so part of what I'm trying to argue for and demonstrate is we need to be, and we do this actually in a very pragmatic way every day. We work with and study with and shop alongside people who, if we sat down with them and interrogated all of their deepest beliefs, we would find some beliefs they hold are deeply problematic to us. We would find them morally harmful to society. We would hope that their policy preferences never win. And yet, because we see them as more than the sum total of a couple of beliefs, we actually do life with them, and we don't think that they are defined by the totality of evil. And that's kind of how we have to do society in a diverse democracy. And I worry when we start to follow the rhetoric of the bad faith partisans who say, if you don't agree with me, you're evil. We fall into this trap of forgetting that. And so I think the thrust of my argument is to the people who are willing to entertain that possibility and then work hard with actual practices to protect against it, not so much for the person who's already acting in bad faith.
Yes, right there, second row.
Hey, really enjoyed that. Thanks for being here. I know this always isn't the most optimistic type of conversation, but I will say one of the most hopeful things I've read in the past few years was, I think, the last chapter of your book, In Confident Pluralism, talks about unlikely partnerships. And I love it because it goes not just from dissent or tolerance, but it shows how people with deep difference work together. And so I have wanted to cultivate an imagination for this type of partnership or agreement. And I think since you wrote that book, it's gotten even maybe more rare.
Yeah.
And so, but I still want to remain hopeful for that. So just places that you see that, or personally, are you hopeful for that? Or where else do you see that? I would like to see unlikely partnerships kind of more in our imagination, and I feel like they're disappearing.
Yeah, I do. Well, thanks for saying that, first of all. That's an encouragement to me. And I would say I am encouraged when I see people acting to protect civil liberties, especially on behalf of people who aren't them, right? And that's happening. I think there are advocacy organizations and others out there who will take positions and say, we don't agree with this group at all. We actually think the purpose of this group is kind of harmful to society, but yes, they have a right to protest and they have a First Amendment right. And we're going to go on record and we're going to spend resources to help protect that right for them, because we know that it matters to us too. Those are unlike, I once represented a group of religious organizations that included the Catholic Church, the Baha'i, the Hare Krishnas. That group together, I don't think there was a single theological point they agreed upon, but they all agreed upon the right to protest. And they joined with the ACL, the CIO, right, the labor unions, and because everyone was saying this is important, even though we don't agree on anything else. So I'm optimistic there. I think at the local, I don't have a lot of good national examples to give you here, but I think at the local level, the people who are still trying to do practical politics and realize that it depends upon building coalitions, even when they're contingent coalitions or limited coalitions, that act of political work humanizes the other side a bit, but also gets real things done in society. Like, you gotta fix the school, or you gotta help with this part of your city that is torn and broken. That you can do that much more effectively when you partner broadly with different coalitions. And I think that's possible. I think there are lots of performative examples of this where people, do a talk show and say, hey, I think this and you think that, but here we are smiling on TV. And I'm less inspired by those, but maybe, I'll give you one that's maybe more optimistic, although this will be surely controversial. Recently, Justice Sonia Sotomayor and Justice Amy Coney Barrett spoke at Georgetown, two very different ideologically positioned justices, and they said, we're friends, we respect each other, we spend a lot of time together, we disagree on the law, we write very sharp opinions because it's important to speak candidly, and we're friends. So what do you do with that? When that hit the news, the comment section of news articles was not very charitable. And so I guess your answer could be, those 9 justices, they're all playing a game and they're fooling all of us. But if you have to believe that all 9 of them are in on it, because they all kind of say the same thing. Or you could say, maybe this institution actually is quite differently situated than Congress, where they don't actually know each other and don't spend time together. And maybe there's something to that. And yes, they sometimes play politics, but they also call each other out on the politics, and they have very contingent coalitions where they're with people on one case and against people on another, and maybe there's something in that could be an optimistic example for the rest of us. And then I would say, like, whatever you think about the Supreme Court, it's also important to remember that 3% of the cases are super high stakes and super culture warsy and make the news, but they're also doing a lot of mundane work with cases that none of us know about, but they're making government function in a way that other parts of the government are doing less well. And I think there's something to that partnership across difference and those contingent coalitions that matter to this and that maybe we can learn from. So some optimism in the midst of a challenging time, I think.
Yes, in the far back.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm actually a pre-law student myself, and honestly, your whole perspective about forgiveness really gave me a new vision of criminal justice reform. So thank you so much for that also. I'm actually one of the students with the Dial Center for Speech and Communication Studies, and I asked this question to anybody who's coming out to talk about, building back meaningful discourse. To what extent do you think lack of foundational or taught effective listening skills could be that missing piece in the puzzle, or even more specifically in the field of law?
Say the last part again.
Sorry. To what extent do you think effective listening skills or teaching these effective listening skills is that missing piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, effective listening skills is part of it's certainly part of it. And I guess I want to generalize that point to say that, and especially for younger people here tonight, that we're all doing this, but when we're spending time online and engaged in various social media, regardless of what it is, I know this varies by generation, we probably have everything from Facebook to TikTok represented here, but whatever it is, that is not modeling effective listening, empathetic communication. And the more time we're fooling ourselves if we think we can do that for 5 hours a day and then come to a classroom with real human beings and behave differently. We're being formed and habituated to follow our worst instincts with our online engagement. And I mean, I'm not a tech pessimist here. I think there's lots of good from technology, but just don't think you can spend lots of hours a day doing that and then be a different person in your offline experiences. So whatever this is doing, and when the algorithms come into play, we're not going to beat the algorithms. So force yourself to do counter practices that will mitigate against the habits that you're forming online, and maybe that's part of effective listening as well. Thanks.
All right. Let me move back this way. Anyone on this side?
There's one over here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Students first. Sorry, Chris. Yes.
Hello. So, which disagreements should we resolve with appeal to law, and which should we leave to the private sector?
It's a good question. It's very big. I'm trying to figure out how to even start with it. I don't know. I like the question, but it's complex enough where I don't have a great answer. But we should start with the recognition that even though we had a really, I think, important exchange about the use of coercion and violence by the law, that it's not like the private sector is without power and coercion. So I don't think it's not a matter of, let's go with the option that's not using power, because it's power all the way down. And so, I guess I would want to, take a specific issue and think about it, but it's also beyond, I doubt I'd have an answer on the spot that would be brilliant and convincing on any particular issue.
Okay, should I provide a particular issue?
Sure, yeah, we can try.
Okay, so let's say we're having a disagreement over whether I should be allowed to discriminate against certain people at my business, right? And so I say I should be able to, you say I shouldn't. And so we appeal to the government and we vote and we decide that I should not be able to discriminate at my private business.
Yeah.
And so, if I do discriminate at my private business, there's the force of government to stop me from doing that.
And the alternative would be leave it to the market to decide, right, that sort of thing.
So
That's an awesome question. And there are people here at UF Law School who teach semester-long courses on exactly that question. And to answer that question with any kind of nuance, we'd have to talk about so many different factors that I would leave it. And I teach versions of this issue too. it's a great question. It's an example of the kind of core disagreement that affects lots of people in very personal ways. And we would want to talk a whole lot about a whole lot of things, including what form of discrimination against which characteristic in which context, in which legal framework. Is it employment discrimination or sale of goods? And there are a ton of laws and a ton of perspectives to think about. So this is not like a long-winded punt on this. This is to say you're asking a really great and complicated question, and there is not a soundbite answer to it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Chris.
Thanks very much. Does the obligation to practice this fall more heavily on people with power, or the winners, as you called them? Do they have some sort of special obligation? And do we even know who they are? Because as far as I can tell, everybody feels like they're losing. So everyone's feeling very vulnerable. And your thoughts on whether that's part of the problem, that we're all sort of feeling on the outside of something, even though there's quite a lot of power to go around.
Yeah, no, I love it. Yes, the obligation is asymmetrical. If you're in a position of power, I think there's more of a burden on you to be more patient and more listening. And the greater the asymmetry exists, the more that burden exists. Second point related to your comment, and it's very messy to figure out who has the power. I mean, I would say most days, I mean, if you're a law student in here, most days of the week, in most contexts, your professors have the power in that dynamic. In a situation where I am the professor and 100 students stand up and start protesting me, which has happened only once, but in that room and in that moment, I did not have the power. And you could say, well, you still had power in the broader context, but in that moment, the power dynamic shifted quickly and strikingly. So here's another example to illustrate the point. Like, let's say you're in a conservative suburb of Austin and you're worried about drag queen story hour at the public library. So you bring a protest against the library. Well, who has the power in that situation? Is it the public library, or is it the wealthy Austin suburb that's protesting, or is it the progressive city of Austin and their government, or the conservative state of Texas and their government, or the Biden administration? And at all different levels of that scenario, like to your point, everyone's going to claim that they don't have the power and that the other side needs to be generous. And the answer to that, I don't even know how to begin to answer that question descriptively. Who has the power, and where should, as a moral or normative first principle, where should the burden fall? I don't know. But I think actually you hinted at a plausible step forward in the tail end of your question, which is to say a lot of us have a lot of power, and a lot of us exercise power strategically, including in situations where we say we don't have the power. So I would start by, like, at a place like this campus, the flagship school of this state, and the people in the system, there is a lot of power and privilege. And it doesn't mean it's perfectly symmetrical, but I think to start with the recognition that even the ability to have these kinds of discussion is itself a pretty privileged position to be. It doesn't mean that doesn't mean that there aren't asymmetries, but it does mean that we can start there, I think.
Any other questions?
By the way, just quickly, when I was protesting, it wasn't really me. It was like a proxy protest, but I was the.
Tell us more.
I will tell. My friend Ibu Patel, I mentioned him earlier, the founder of a group called Interfaith America, which is a really important civic organization in this country, the leading interfaith organization. And Ibu and I are good friends. And we've gone around and done speaking at different college campuses about the importance of religious pluralism. And we spoke at one campus, I won't name it, not here. And the president of the university had brought us in, and the students were protesting the president, but because we were her signature event, we became the proxy object of the protest. So unbeknownst to us, most of the audience were student protesters. And we did a dialogue, and then when we turned it over to Q&A, they all stood up at once and started chanting and protesting. And my first move was to think, well, at the moment I thought, there is a power asymmetry now, but I'm not in a position, if I try to push back in this moment, there's no way that I win this, right? Because I'm still a professor, and I don't. So I thought, I'm just gonna sit here and just follow my host, the president of the university, and just wait for her to see and I'll just sit up here as long as she wants me to. So 45 minutes later, they're still protesting and we're still sitting up there and it's super awkward. And then they finally call it and she walks up and says, I think we're going to cancel the book table. And we're both like, oh yeah. No problem there. You know, and it was very surreal because I advise lots of people on protest and how to protest and what their rights are. But when you're the object of a protest, it's a far different experience.
So we're almost out of time. Since we're just about out of questions, I'm going to allow myself to ask one more that's a little bit off our topic. But Professor Inazu really made his name researching the right of assembly under the First Amendment. And when you talked about civic organizations and you yourself have started a nonprofit, can you maybe just tell the audience a little bit about the importance of the right of assembly and also civic organizations in our society?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. Here's what I would say. So I kind of sort of stumbled upon the right of assembly when I was in graduate school, and it turned out that nobody had written on it in 40 years. So it was like the perfect dissertation topic. But one of the things that I explored about the right of assembly, it's one of 5 individual rights in the First Amendment. It's the only one that requires more than one person to be exercised. So the press, I can get online and publish something and be the press and sometimes be protected by the press right. I can petition the government on my own. I can speak by myself. In at least some faiths, I can practice religion by myself, but I cannot assemble by myself. It requires at least more than one person to come together and assemble. And so part of my argument from that early work was to say that built into the founding, and there are debates around the first Congress about why have a right of assembly and why does it matter, is the sense that no, we actually live in society, not just as detached individuals, but as groups of people who come together for all purposes. And that's really good, but it's also kind of destabilizing. Madison called them factions. They weren't good things for Madison. They were a fact of life. And in some ways, we negotiate life in this world living with these uneasily and destabilizing different groups where we pursue different identities and different ways of life. And it's very important to protect them and then figure out how to talk and relate across from them, which then takes us, I think, to the most recent book.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.